Thank you for inviting me. And thanks for all the people who have clicked in here. I'm really fascinated by how many people. I didn't expect this many people. And there's even a few friends of mine that I noticed that have not said that they even knew about this. So I'm kind of happy from back east. Would it surprise you, those of you watching, if I told you that 41 Jews won Olympic medals between 1968 and 2016? That's medals, gold, silver, and bronze. And 27 of them have been gold, all in swimming. Now, I'm sure, or I would guess, that most of you heard of Mark Spitz, who won 7 golds in 1972. But he also won 4 or 5 medals in 1968 at the games, but he only won 2 medals, so he didn't get much credit for that at the time. Also, we've had most of the swimming medal winners have been Americans. Taurus, who won probably a dozen medals, both gold, silver, and bronze. And she's been in the Olympics from since the 1984 Olympics, had a few kids, and came back as recently as the 2012 Olympics and also won medals. So it just seems to, out here, the people that I'm in contact with mostly, particularly with the new book, are surprised that Jews won that many medals in one sport. But really, since the beginning of the modern Olympics, which is 1896, there was the old Olympics where men wore sheets and did all kinds of wrestling and track and field games. 1,000 years went by, and then a Frenchman by the name of Pierre de Coubertin, not Jewish, but in his 20s, came up with the idea for the Olympics, for an Olympics. And by the time he was 33, I believe, he actually staged the first modern Olympic Games. And he had 4 other cohorts on the original International Olympic Committee. One of them was Jewish. And the one that was Jewish was the one that was required to do the most work. His name was Ferenc Kevany. And he was the general secretary of the group. And these were all young men that had met each other at various educational situations, mostly the Sorbonne. In those days, if you were wealthy, and Baron de Coubertin came from a moneyed family, you didn't work. You try to find something to do. So usually they went in the army. De Coubertin went in to the army, didn't like it, and quit. Can you imagine today that people would quit the army, at least the American army? But he quit the army, and his parents were concerned that he needed to find himself. I don't know that they used the term back in those days, but they send him to England to find himself. And as a 24, 25-year-old kid, kid to me, he hung around other young people, which included young people from the colleges there, from where he saw for the first time in his life cricket and lawn bowling, and he hadn't seen tennis before. And anyways, a few sports, but what he saw was the camaraderie between the students, particularly the male students, and the support of the female students for sport. And de Coubertin's brother had been in the Franco-Prussian War where France got murdered. Bad choice of words, but got crushed by the Prussians. And his brother came back from the war, a changed young man. And the younger brother, de Coubertin, said there's got to be a better way to live in life. He was a peacenik at the time. They didn't have that term, but that's what he was. Came back from France, and the parents saw that he was still disturbed, needed something to do, so they sent him to America. They didn't put him on a jet. They didn't have those then. And they sent him on a liner, which took however long to get from wherever to the United States. Hung out in Eastern United States at Princeton and Yale and Rutgers and the East Coast, and saw again American college students enjoying themselves, having a rivalry, but solving the rivalry either by drinking beer, I suppose, but also running and jumping and doing whatever sports they did in the United States, which were different than the sports that he had seen in England and that he had seen in France. Anyways, he came back, and his parents were tired of sending him overseas, so they sent him to the Sorbonne. And he was a very intelligent young man. He used to do a lot of writing. He meets a girl at the Sorbonne. Don't they always do that? And the scenario was that he got together with a couple of guys, one of them being Ferenc Kemeny, and they said, let's put together this international sporting event. It'll solve the world's problems. They can come no matter who hates whom. They can get together and play on a field, and whoever wins, at the end, one could be defeated and one could be happy, but they could all go out and drink beer and celebrate together. And that's what these guys did for about 3 years in France. And somehow or other, in 1896, they staged the first modern Olympic Games in Athens. And you would expect if you accept the phrase, what do Jews have to do with sports, as so many people do, so many Jews do in particular. There were 8 Jewish medals won at that first, 8 medals won by 5 Jews at the first Olympics. And there weren't that many events. And the Jews excelled at gymnastics. Would you expect that? There weren't many sports either. There was tennis. There were no Jews in tennis, but there were only 3 players, and they had doubles, is what was one of the events. So somebody who from England, who was a sailor who had come to watch the games, heard the call out. They needed a second player for the doubles. He played doubles and won the silver medal. That's the kind of event that was. But it was so well accepted by the Greeks. It was not well accepted by the British. They only sent 4 people to that Olympics. The United States sent 12, only 12. And the AAU never sanctioned it because the head of the AAU was an Irishman who they say hated Jews. And so a professor at Princeton put together the team. He wasn't a coach. He just put together the team. And the Americans won nearly every track and field medal that was offered. There were only something like 270 athletes that entered that competition. But for Jews to win 8 medals was kind of extraordinary. From that point forward, people started seeing opportunities for the Olympics, and more Jews started getting involved, particularly through universities here in the United States, and but from all over. A problem they had, though, was there were no federations. Now every sport that's in the Olympics has a federation, which controls the rules and the standards and the practices and the etiquette of each sport. From those Olympics, these things developed. Jews excelled at gymnastics. There's been a few books written about Jews in the Olympics. You can find them if you actually look for them. People don't usually look for them because I don't think they think Jews have much to do with sports in general, and even in professional sports here in the United States. But they do. If their name isn't Goldberg or Ginsburg or Schwartz, you don't notice. But if their name is Kelly, like there's a guy on the baseball team, the Israeli baseball team playing in the Olympics this year has a player named Kelly. Now his father is not Jewish, but his mother is Jewish. And if you have ancestry, it's not only for Israel, for Italy and for Nairobi and whatever other countries are in different sports, you can get citizenship, at least in most of these countries, to play for your mother country, they call it. So over the years, more Jews participated in the games and won medals. However, until we started the Hall of Fame, well, maybe before that, in 1966, a book was published called The Encyclopedia of Jews in Sports. It was by two cousins, the Silvers, Jesse Silver and Roy Silver, and a man by the name of Postal. And the Silvers were both sports writers, and their passion as children was cutting out articles out of the New York, they were New Yorkers, cutting articles out of the New York papers that referenced anybody that looked Jewish in sports, that had accomplished something. And they put a book together that is about 1.5 inches thick. It's out of print, but you can probably find it at old bookstores. And guys my age, I won't tell you, but guys my age who got them as bar mitzvah gifts and haven't probably been opened since the bar mitzvah. It's an incredible book, and it covers not just the United States, it's heavy on the United States, but it covers everywhere. And most of the people in the book are Jewish. And when I say most, I say about 85%. Some of the Greensteins and Goldsteins and Goldbergs aren't necessarily Jewish, as we learn as we get older. Other countries have people with names like that, Germanic names in particular. Anyhow, women were not invited to play in the Olympics until 1928. It was an offense, and women in those days were complaining about it. And the Americans in particular, there was a lady named Charlotte Epstein, who was a stenographer in New York. And you know what they say about stenographers in New York, they're very bossy. And she loved to swim. She used to go to whatever athletic club she used to go to swim in New York. And there were women there, young ladies that were superb swimmers. Anyway, she got the idea of getting lady swimmers into the Olympics and organized the U.S. Women's Swimming Association, which most American people in sports frowned upon. When World War I started, so that all got put on hold. But in 1928, for the 1928 games, obviously it started before, women were entered in the in the swimming competition. And also gymnastics was women's gymnastics was entered. Men's gymnastics had been there since the first games. The same year, track and field for women, several events were instituted. And it just expanded the Olympics far beyond what Pierre de Coubertin had envisioned. I don't know if you hear the motor outside. Is it bothering you? It's bothering
I hear it
you.
in the background, Joe. We can still hear you. Thanks.
I do that. Instead of music, I have a machine behind me making noise. In 1928, one of the sports was discus throwing. The Greeks wanted to have, because they figured that the Olympics were their activity. The French didn't believe that, but so to appease the Greeks, they put discus in women's discus and men's discus. But no Americans threw the discus at that time, or very few. They didn't do it in competition. On the West Coast, we had a USC college student who was a super athlete, Lillian Copeland, Jewish girl. At the time, her exploits, she was a champion in everything except whatever events Babe Didrikson Zaharias. You ever hear of her? Some of you, I'm sure, did. She was the super athlete. And she played sports that men loved. For example, golf. And she got a lot of publicity as being a woman who played in some men's tournaments, or they allowed her to. And Lillian Copeland was selected because she was the U.S. shot put champion, the AAU U.S. champion. But since there was no discus, there was no shot put, they asked her, how about throwing the discus? Well, she didn't know from that, but she said, sure, enter me. They couldn't find a discus in the United States, but there was a statue somewhere on some campus of a discus thrower. They chiseled away the discus, which was made out of concrete, by the way, and she practiced with it until she broke it. Then they had fashioned a model of that discus, and that's how she practiced for the Olympics. She went to the Olympics and in the practices, it was the first time she had ever held in her hand a real discus. And she went out and she didn't win the gold, she won the silver. And she hated the event, by the way, but she wasn't a professional athlete. They didn't have athletes like they do now. She was going to school, and her career became a cop. She was a cop with the LA police. She didn't follow through with it, but she did in 1932 win the shot put also in the Olympics and a couple of other events. She was the fastest runner, the fastest this, the strongest that. She inspired many, many women, but in those days, she was not a woman that was very public. She would have been, I think, an LGBT, whatever the letters are. And they say she was very, very shy. But she worked with in the children's division of the LA police force, won all kinds of awards there, not for her sports, but for her work. And in Los Angeles today, there's a large poster of her in the Jewish area, the old Jewish area, the Pico Robertson area, which is not far from where I am right now, of her winding up to throw the discus. And so that was an event. Also at the 1928, they introduced winter sports. And we had an American named Irving Jaffe, a New Yorker, who was the national champion, speed champion. And he entered the event. Sweden was a Swede was the leading speed skater in those days at the longer events. They didn't have the shorter events, the longer events. And during the competition, the competition was outside. They didn't have any arenas. The ice started to melt. And Irving Jaffe was leading at the end of the semifinals for the gold medal. They didn't play the finals because the ice was considered too soft. So they awarded Irving Jaffe the gold medal. After he was awarded the gold medal, the Olympic Committee there took the medal away, saying it was a non-event because they didn't complete the event. Shortly thereafter, the International Federation, the Ice Skating Federation, reinstated the gold medal. Later on, the medal was taken away by another lawsuit. What can you say? It was going up and back. Those that didn't like the Jews, that's what they said it was about. We can't let a Jew win that award. Irving Jaffe, by the way, went on to be an instructor in the mountains, in the Catskills, wherever they have winter sports. I don't know New York, but there's upstate New York. He was there for many years. I had the good pleasure of meeting him and Lillian. I didn't meet Lillian, no, Lillian I didn't meet. But in most of the great Olympians, well, I'm skipping ahead a little. I'm going ahead to, in 1979, I had this idea of raising money for the Maccabea Games. I had been a cricket player for the US in 1973. We want to talk about Jewish cricket teams. That year we had a cricket team. And in 1977, I also was at the Maccabea as a lawn bowler. You have lawn bowling in Central Park, I know in New York and New Jersey, and probably whatever town that you're in, if you're in a Sunbelt town or city, you have a bowling green. Wherever there was a street called Bowling Green Drive or street or place, there probably one day was a bowling green there when the English conquered, or not conquered, but came to the came to America. And when the Americans, the new US chased out the British, there went the bowling green itself, but the street remained. Anyways, I ran a dinner to raise money for the Maccabea. And I invited all these great athletes, half of them which were Olympians, Mark Spitz, for example, and most of them came. We inducted 18 for Chai, and 12 of them came. Four of the deceased athletes' relatives came. 2 could not come. And it was an awesome evening. Not only did the athletes come, and these are athletes, we're talking about Hank Greenberg and Sandy Koufax and those, Red Auerbach, Dick Savitt, the tennis player, Dolph Schayes, the basketball player, Sid Luckman, the Chicago Bears quarterback, etc. not only did they come, but they invited their friends. And whether they were lying or not, or making up something to make me feel good, most of them said this award had meant the most to them of anything they had received since their playing days. And understand, at that time in 1979, there weren't a plethora of regional Jewish sports halls of fame. There weren't a lot of people talking about Jewish sportsmen, other than that book I mentioned before, the Encyclopedia of Jews in Sports. So it was an event that took on a life of its own. And 2 years later, we had a museum, a chartered museum by the Israeli or the Israel Board of Education. It wasn't called the Board of Education, but you know what I mean. At the Wingate Institute, which is a sports campus, where if you want to be a coach or learn about physiology, things having to do with the handicapped and getting them involved in sports, this is the campus. And by the way, it was opened when it opened. Eleanor Roosevelt was the one who cut the ribbon. And as a matter of fact, the person who brought Eleanor Roosevelt was a gentleman by the name of Haskell Cohn. And those of you from New Jersey in particular, and New York, might recognize the name. He was a very important Jewish sportsman. He was the NBA, before the NBA was the NBA. He was the publicist for the BAA. There was all kind of AAs back in the old days, before the NBA became the NBA. And Haskell is a former president, or was, of the organization called U.S. Committee Sports for Israel, which was organized in part by Haskell to get Israel into the Olympics, which they did for the 1952 games. And there was a quid pro quo deal there. If people who didn't like Israel would vote for Israel, the people who didn't like Russia or the Soviet Union would vote for the Soviet Union. And that's when the Soviet Union got into the Olympics the same time as Israel. So what happened at that, World War II got in the way. It's a big thing to get in the way. By the time that happened, so many great athletes from the first half of the 20th century were now too old for the Olympics. We here in the United States sent a wrestler by the name of Henry Wittenberg. He was a cop. He was one of these guys that wasn't invited to tryouts. He was a wrestler. He wasn't invited to tryouts, but he came anyways to the tryouts and won the tryouts in the light heavyweight division. And he made the team, and he went and won a gold medal. In Hungary had Agnes Coletti, who was a wonderful gymnast in the late 1930s, lost the entire World War II years. He couldn't perform then. I mean, you could perform, but not hiding most of the time. She entered the 1948 Olympics. Now, she was like 8 or 9 years older than she was what am I talking about? She was much older than when the World War II started. She ended up winning in the next 3 Olympics. can you imagine? She was in her 40s at the time, on the parallel bars, swinging and doing all the things that Allie Raisman has been doing. She was doing then at that age, and won about, I think, 11 medals, mostly gold, silver, and bronze. There were people like that. But Agnes Coletti never connected with the American market. They didn't know about her. And Henry Wittenberg never connected, that's the wrestler, never connected with anybody in the United States, other than the people probably at the New York Athletic Club and other places where he wanted to wrestle, but they wouldn't let him wrestle there because he was Jewish. Excuse me, let me have a swig. Back in the 30s, Hungary, as far as Jewish athletes went, Jewish athletes from various different countries won medals between 1896 and the 1930s. That doesn't mean that more Jews had not entered. I can give you, and I'll give you a list of some of the Jews that have entered for this year's Olympics, which start on Friday. But you forget about those people, except the people in the immediate area or who are their friends or stuff. I was with somebody last night, we had dinner, a group of us, and the guy said, when I tried out for the Olympics, I didn't even know he did anything. He was a runner, a hurdler, jumping over sticks. You got to jump over something, jumping over sticks. But in the 1930s, the Hungarians dominated the fencing field. Jews had always been very strong in the fencing field, going back to between 1900 and 1910 and 1912. Some of the great legends of fencing were then, and about 3 of them got exterminated in the camps. That's how much the Germans not relished, but worshipped their Olympians. They did, but not if they were Jewish. And if you take a look, it's in my book, but you don't have to buy my book, but buy my book. Don't let me take you away from buying my book. But there's a website called www.jewishsports.net. And if you go there, there's an Olympic category written by Dr. George Eisen, who is the principal author of the Holocaust Museum in Washington exhibit in 1996 of the 1936 Olympics. He's an authority on the 1936 Olympics and sports in Europe at that time. And you can see how dominant the Jews were in fencing. So you ask the question, or you could ask the question, why fencing? Well, they say that so many Jews were conscripted into the military in past years that Jews just became fencers. Not all became Olympic fencers or Olympic quality fencers, but they were fencers. And it carried through before World War I started. And then in the 30s, there's a number of them that won gold, silver, and bronze. I'll tell you one story about one guy. His name was Attila Petschauer. I may be saying the first name incorrectly, but he was a Hungarian, and he was a savant fencer. He fenced foil and épée. There are 3 events: foil, épée, and sabre. he won multiple gold medals, as did other athletes, other fencers. But he got a pass from the Germans at first, the occupying Germans, that he didn't have to go to a prison camp. He didn't go to a concentration camp. One day he was out for a walk and he had left his papers at home. He met the wrong Gestapo guy on the street. The guy sent him to jail. He went to a camp. They sent him to a camp, and he was very soft. He was a soft man, but that's how they describe him, as the soft man. They were out in the cold area wherever he was in prison. It was freezing cold, snowing below zero. And an officer came by, and the officer on a horse happened to be a former Olympian that Petschauer had made friends with at the 1932 Olympics. So after they took him aside and everything, and then they say that the officer felt like the other guards were very curious about how he was treating the Jew. So he said to the commandant, "Take care of this man." When the officer on horseback left, the commandant told Petschauer to climb a tree. You're the top man, or however he was described, climb a tree. Well, Petschauer climbed up to whatever branch he could get up to. And they told him to take off his clothes. He took off his clothes. I mean, he had no choice. While all the other men are standing around however they have people, the prisoners standing, he takes off his clothes. The other guards bring out a hose and they hose down Petschauer in this freezing weather. Well, obviously he freezes, and he freezes to death. And this story was a story that's passed down. It's in the book, the Encyclopedia of Jews and Sports, and the biography of Petschauer. But it's also, I've read about it other places. If you read about the Olympics, various writers try to go lightly on the anti-Semitism between sportsmen at the Olympics, but they tell this story a little diluted maybe than what I just said, or even stronger than what I said. But there was a movie out, and I think it was with Maximilian Schell. No, it was with Roy Fiennes, the actor. And it was 100 years of a family called Sun and Shine. And I believe the movie was Sunshine, but this was the Sun and Shine family, and they made wine. And it was how the family developed over the years. And the one character, Roy Fiennes, is a fencer in the family. And he's very good at his club. To his club, they had fencing clubs in Hungary, but the big one was the non-Jewish one. And they expelled him from the club. This is before the Nazis. And so he joined the Jewish club, but he vowed that he was going to make this the big Hungarian fencing club, which he did. And they sent him to the Olympics, and they tell this story about Petschauer. They don't call him Petschauer. They call this character, they take this character, put him together with another fencer who also won gold medal, Jewish fencer who also won gold medals at those Olympics. And it's a very moving part of the story. Anyways, that's a story. Another story, she didn't play in the Olympics because they said she was too young. And she also didn't fight it. She was 16. Her name was, car just went by zooming. Oh. Well, I'll get to her name in a moment. She was a ping pong player. She was a tennis player, but was too small to play with the big ladies. So her father, who, by the way, was a big-time Broadway producer, Ruth Aarons was her name, Aarons. And so she took up ping pong. And what do you know? She became the US champion. And so whoever picked out table tennis players, they call it table tennis, not ping pong, but it's ping pong. To you and me, it's ping pong. To them, she went there and knocked off all the top women of Europe, including the Hungarians. And she played the championship match against the German champion, past champion, and beat her. And the German champion did something that other Germans in 1936 were not doing in sports, going over to the Americans and shaking their hand. She went over to Ruth Aarons to shake her hand, and Ruth Aarons, a 16-year-old who was a secular Jew, didn't know from much religion, refused to shake her hand. And then she became famous in her era as a Jewish table tennis player. And she went on to bigger and better things. She won a few more championships, but liked being in show business. And before she died, she was the manager, the personal manager of David Cassidy, the singer, and Shirley Jones, David Cassidy's stepmother. The U.S. boycotted the 1936 Olympics. It's a big movement. America, the world maybe, was starting to recognize Hitler was Hitler. They weren't listening to the people who were saying he was Hitler. It was kind of like, I hope I'm not offending anybody, but it was like talking about climate warming. What do I want to say? Well, the climate today, most people, or many people, did not recognize what was going on in Germany, but there was a movement to boycott the Olympics. And it was not only the Jews, a Jewish leader, but it was a Catholic. The Jews and the Catholics tried to, and they almost did it, but they did not. There were some professional anti-Semites involved in the, that's my designation, professional, in the US Olympic movement. One who was high up who said, what do we care about Jews? If Jews did not go to the Olympics, what do we care? There are no Jews who could compete in sports with real sportsmen. I'm paraphrasing, but that's generally what they said. So Jews did not go to the 1930s. Jews boycotted the 1936 Olympics. What am I talking about? What am I talking about? Many Jews boycotted the Olympics. Two of them were runners from Princeton. One's name was Green and the other name was Connors. Connors spelled Cahners. Connors, I believe, became a publisher. And Green became a multimillionaire builder. And I had a good opportunity to meet Green in Israel when he came from his induction into the Jewish Sports Hall of Fame at Woodgate Institute. And what a vital man this guy was. That was the year in Israel. I'm hopping around here, but it was 1997. And the opening ceremonies to the Maccabi Games, they had all the athletes in a holding area for security. And then they were to go out of the holding area, just walk over a very short, newly constructed bridge into the stadium. And the United States was, we all had banners saying what country we were. And the United States was America at that time. But someone made a mistake and put America third to walk into the stadium. And the second team to walk into the stadium, the one before the Americans, were the Australians. And when the fourth person went over the little bridge, it collapsed. And the bridge was over a river called the Yarkon River. The river was about 4 feet wide at that point and filthy dirty, going back probably to biblical days. And the end result was 4 people were submerged in it or swallowed the water and died. 4 Maccabi athletes died from that thing. This we didn't know if it was a terrorist. Nobody knew. There's maybe 7,000, 8,000 athletes in this holding area. And there's helicopters all over. We thought it was part of the opening ceremonies. And we didn't know, and in those days, very few people had cell phones. And the only reason why we found out eventually what was going on, because the cell phones somehow started to work there. They had shut off all the electronics and all that, started to work. And the Israelis who had cell phones were getting calls from their parents or whoever, or they were calling, and they were describing what was going on the other side of the wall. And this Mr. Green, who was in our group with me, they let us out of the stadium the back way. So in order to get to our buses, we had to walk around the stadium. And the stadium was famous for having a huge amount of land. We had to walk 1.5 miles around the stadium, led by this man. And he walked, he was like 85 or 86 years old. He walked with the spirit of a 20-year-old. I had to get to all that to tell you how fast or how healthy this man was. But he didn't go to the games. He was convinced, as many Jews were, not to participate in the Nazi Olympics, which they were being called at that time. There were 2 Americans that did go, and one of them should be very familiar to New Yorkers. One was Marty Glickman, the sportscaster, and the other was Stoller. His last name was Stoller, and he was from Michigan. Marty, both of them were high school whizzes on track and field. Particularly, Marty was a phenom. He won everything. And he had been signed by the, well, he couldn't sign because he was in the Olympics, but he was going to play with the New York Giants, I believe, football team. And he wanted to be a sportscaster. And I spent some time with Marty, not Stoller, but Marty, and he was very bitter about it. The last time I saw him was in 1996 at the Holocaust exhibit for the 1936 Olympics. They invited him as a guest to be there. And Marty told the story of not what was written about why they didn't. Oh, I didn't tell you. Stoller and Glickman were members of the U.S. 4x100 relay team, which was the premier track and field event at the 36 Olympics. And the Germans, that was their crowning achievement. They were promoting how much they were going to take, not only most of the track and field awards, but particularly that award. Well, that was also the year of Jesse Owens. And if you follow old-time sports, you know that Jesse Owens was the greatest track star that the United States, maybe anybody ever produced, at least up to that time and a long time after that too. He won 4 gold medals at that Olympic Games, but the 4th one was because he was forced to take Marty Glickman's place. And Stoller lost his place by being taken by Ralph Metcalf, who became an Illinois congressman afterward. Both of these guys, obviously, Metcalf and Owens, had won their gold medals, and they had a meeting. The U.S. team had a meeting before that particular race, in which the coach, Cromwell, was the coach of the United States team, told the entire U.S. team that the Germans had been hiding their best runners. That's why they were losing the earlier races, and they were going to race them in the 4x100. So therefore, the Americans had to replace Glickman and Stoller with Metcalf and Owens, which they did. And obviously, the U.S. won the race easily. Stoller shrugged his shoulders and said anti-Semites and went back to school. He had to go back to school. Glickman carried it as a chip on his shoulder throughout his career. We had him in Israel to do part of a documentary, the opening of a documentary, and he opened it up with a speech about his being ignored and being dissed at the 1936 Olympics. He had a better attitude when I saw him in 1996, but that was a story that was passed over by the Olympics for all the years that after 1936 until the late 90s, when a new president got involved with the International Olympic Committee, and they reinstated an award for both Stoller and for Glickman that they should have had. There was a movement to say something at the Olympics, but they wouldn't. The Olympic Committee couldn't go that far. They also couldn't go that far for the Israeli athletes that were murdered in 1972. I'm sure everybody watching this Zoom is aware of what happened in 1972, but if not, Israeli athletes were all housed in a Olympic village. Arab terrorists climbed over the fence and broke their way into the dorm where they were living, killed one of the guys. The Israelis fought them back, but They didn't have machine guns. One was killed there. A few escaped, but 11 died. They didn't die there. They took the Israelis hostage, and it went on. It was a major. It occupied all television broadcasting at that time, and the deal became: we get rid of the hostages if you let us go free. And a bus took them to the bad guys to the airport along with their hostages. And one thing led to another, and snipers made a mistake, but you never really know. And the end result was everybody was killed, the hostages and the Arabs. It was an awful time, but it changed how sports are handled from a security standpoint, not only for Jews, but for everybody. Look at what's going on now. The pandemic has made it even worse. There was a movement on, and there has been for years, for the Olympic Committee to say something about what happened in Munich. Now, you may not be aware of it because we're at an odd year, 2021. But 1972 was 49 years ago. And we're the Olympics, that's 50 years from that Olympics. To give a commemoration for the athletes that died. From what I understand, there are no plans for anything like that. And what can you say? The people who say it. And it's like almost everything that has a cause, there's a counter cause, and the counter cause is louder. Anyways, in my book, we recognize what happened out here in Los Angeles, and I know around the country, there are various JCCs, temples. We have the Wiesenthal Museum here. They do a service for the Munich 11. We've had their kids, their children here, their wives here when they were children. Now they're obviously, excuse me, they're obviously adults, but there is an event going on here at the Wiesenthal. We have a Wiesenthal museum here. It has had probably more recognition here for these athletes than in Los Angeles is not what you would call an ethnic city. Most of us, or many of us, don't know our neighbors on either side of us. Now, I'm talking about the area maybe that I live in, but it's not like being in New York or Chicago, the Eastern Series, where you can feel the pulse of whatever ethnicity you have. But from what I understand, there's less recognition of the murdered Olympics. And this is a wonderful time. That's a bad word to choose, wonderful, but it's a perfect time for organizations to recognize the guys who died and what is still being faced in the Middle East. You can't just legislate hate or love, for that matter. You have to achieve it. And some of these events, to remember the people who have, in this case, the Munich 11, it would probably help the cause if more places did something like that. So if you're listening and you have something to say, it may be too late to do that, but you have next year is 2022, which is the year that would actually be 50 years, and might do some kind of remembrance, if you don't want to call it a memorial. Anyways, and invite maybe an Olympic person from your area, because we have found that many former Olympic, or the ones that we asked, former Olympians, are very prone to raising their hand and showing up at events like that. Would you tell them what it's for? I get emotional just thinking about it. There was another story that has to do with the Olympics that you probably don't know, but maybe you do. There was a German high jumper, a lady named Ethel. Well, she's my discovery and I can't do it, but it's like names. I remember them after I start talking about it.
Someone in the chat had asked earlier about a high jumper, so perhaps this is her, Gretel Bergman.
Gretel Bergman, yes, Gretel Bergman. When we started the Hall of Fame, I got a letter from Gretel Bergman. Had no idea who she was. It came with a couple of scrapbooks of medals, all kinds of medals and awards, and a couple of letters. One saying that she was the top qualifier for the German high jump team in 1936, but she didn't get by it. Read the other letter, she said. The letter was from some high command, German high command, saying, thank you for trying out for the Olympics, but you don't qualify. You don't meet up to the standards of the German. Well, hers was the highest standard. So they said, but you can try out if you further tryouts. However, they banned all the Jews, anybody who was Jewish, they banned them from regular tryouts of the German team. And if you weren't in the tryouts, you couldn't make the team. So she went to these tryouts, as did at least 20 others. And she had a roommate who made the team, who jumped less than she did. She said, by the way, the conditions of jumping was, they jumped off grass that wasn't mowed. The bars that she had to jump over were makeshift lumber. But she still did what she had to do. The roommate turned out to be a man. She didn't know it was a man. Life magazine wrote a story when there was a Life magazine about they were exposing the fact that the person who was on the German Olympic team instead of this lady, Gretel Bergman, was a guy, his last name was Ratjen, R-A-T-J-E-N, I believe. Now I have the hiccups. And they went to that extent. Supposedly, he was supposed to sabotage, first of all, watch over her what she was doing and make sure she didn't do too good. Well, he didn't do anything, she said, but she didn't make the team. She eventually got married. She married a guy who was on one of the other national teams that was Jewish and couldn't play for his college team. And they moved to the United States. They got out to the United States. What they did, they went to England, then they went to Canada, and then they came to the United States. A number of athletes did that. They would run for England, they would run for from Germany or Austria or Hungary. They'd go to England, then Canada, and then the United States. Her married name was Gretel Bergman. And she became very vociferous. I invited her to the second Jewish Sports Hall of Fame dinner, and she was a star. We had all these great athletes there. Dix, well, I won't, I'm trying to remember the athlete. And everybody that was there, it was also at a Beverly Hills hotel. It was a super duper dinner and all that. But the one they wanted to meet was Gretel Bergman, because they had already seen a story in the LA Times that we had in. And she loved to talk. She had all these stories to tell. And you didn't hear these stories from anybody. And she was invited to do several makeup things by the Germans over the years, and she refused. They named the stadium after her. She refused to go to the naming of the stadium. They named a gymnasium after her. They named several things after her. Finally, just before she died, or a year before she died, she went there to see her gymnasium, which she said, first of all, she had said she had never gone back there, but she went back because her grandkids, she wanted them to feel, they didn't know their grandmother was a great athlete, but a super athlete in Germany. And so that was the story that we came upon through the Hall of Fame. The Hall of Fame for me has exposed, I was a baseball player and I got as far as college freshman baseball. I was a basketball player and baseball player, but I wasn't a cricket player and I wasn't a lawn bowler, and I didn't do all these other sporting events. But the Maccabea games like opened up a vista to me, because here were people from Germany, from Belgium, South Africa, Australia, Rhodesia at the time, countries you didn't know that were even countries. And most of them were saying, hello, how are you? They all spoke English because the English had taken over their countries, so the natives spoke. And I said, this is too good of an activity to just let wane without doing something to promote it in the United States, because it was a secret here. Out on the West Coast where I'm at, if you didn't play basketball, you hardly knew about the Maccabea games, because everything was happening in the eastern part of the United States. And I think we did that. I'm now looking at some of the messages here. Well, anyhow, I don't know how people navigate on the Zooms.
It's hard to read them as you're speaking, but there are some questions. If you want to take a couple of questions.
I do. Go ahead.
Great. So before I see John Schilling, I see your hand is raised. So just right before you ask your question, I'll take one from the chat, which is, have there ever been any Orthodox Jews or observant Jews in the Olympics or in major sports?
Well, you're seeing a story now about a basketball kid, a 17-year-old kid who was just signed, a baseball player. He just got signed he just got drafted in the Major League Draft. And he's talking about taking kosher food with them and playing in the game. He's going to be the first one. Number one, I know he's not the first one, but he's the first one in probably his parents' lifetime, or that his parents knew. Not everybody who is Jewish wants to advertise the fact that they're Jewish. They're playing among people that grew up on a farm, grew up in another country, grew up in a major city, grew up loving and hating things that you do or don't do. And not everybody does that. But there was a weightlifter named Ike Berger. He still is, Isaac Berger. He was born in Israel. He's a ordained cantor. And I don't know if he's Orthodox now, but in the 1960s, I believe, 50s, 60s, when he won his gold medals, he was the strongest man in the world. A short guy, but pound for pound, the strongest man in the world. I would imagine he was kosher when he was living in Israel. I don't know how about here. I know about others who have had the conundrum of doing it. What makes it difficult, particularly now, is athletics are played so numerously on weekends and Friday nights, Friday Night Lights, the television show, but what goes on in many states here in the United States. It's the big game. I'll tell you one story about, it's really non-kosher, but it's very Jewish. Ed Asner, you all know who Ed Asner is, Edward Asner, Lou Grant from the Mary Tyler Moore Show. Anybody know? Well, I don't see all your hands, but I would guess that many of you know who Lou Grant is. Thank you. I saw that. I was his publicist back in the day when I was a publicist. I was an entertainment publicist. And we were sitting talking one day, and behind him was on the set of the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And if you happen to watch that show nowadays, when he's in Lou Grant's office, behind him over this shoulder, over his shoulder, there's a picture of him in a football pose. So I said, "You played football?" He says, yeah, don't talk about it. I said, "Well, what shouldn't I talk about? What happened?" He says, "Well, my career ended on Yom Kippur." I said, "What happened?" He said, it was called Nidre time, and my family was religious. I grew up in a religious home, and we had a game that night. He's from Kansas City. And I had a dilemma. I'm an important guy on the team. They're expecting me to play. I'm protecting the quarterback. But my parents are not going to let me play. Well, he played. And this was 40 years later, 50 years later, when it was still bothering him in his head that he played that Yom Kippur. And he didn't play afterwards. He just felt terrible that he did it. And he knew that he shouldn't be. He's very liberal, Ed. He's very open to all kinds of ideas. But he wasn't open to that idea. And I told him I thought that was marvelous, that you even think about it now. But he did. Anyways, next time you watch Mary Tyler Moore in The Office, look over his shoulder, you'll see the picture.
Wow, what a story. John, do you want to ask your question?
Well, I didn't want to ask a question, but I want to add a few names to the Jewish athletes that I knew personally. Number one, there was a fellow named Henry Laskow. He's in the American. You ever hear of him?
Sure, Walker.
Absolutely. He held the world record in the mile for a while, was in 3 Olympics. He's also a Holocaust survivor. He had a lot of stories. He was a Berliner.
Yes.
And he was, I knew him very personally. I used to walk with him. I wasn't as fast as him, but we used to get together. Number two, I knew also on the same club that I was on, the New York Pioneer Club, which was a big competitor against the New York AC. You know their policies, of course, you mentioned it.
Yes.
And I was personally, competed against them, but that's another story. What I wanted to mention is a fellow named of Shaul Adani. Does that name ring a bell?
No.
He's a race walker that was in the 50K walk. He was there at the Olympics and in Munich when they were attacked. He was able to complete his 50K walk before the attack by those Arabs over there, and who climbed over the fence and such as you described. And I was very concerned. I've been seeing him ever since. He's been very active in speaking. He's a retired college professor, quite fluent and very, very vocal as to what he had to say about it. And he's still active. He was recently honored in Munich when they had their, and because he's one of the few survivors still living who survived that Olympics over there. I thought that should be mentioned to some of these minor sports.
Sure. How do you spell his last name?
Shaul, of course, his name, and Ladany, Ladany.
Yes, I know Shaul Ladany.
I know Shaul.
I met
He lives
him
in Omer. I've been with him. He knows me very well. We've gone together in Switzerland quite often. When he was a little younger, he and his wife, and we used to go together hiking over the mountains there. We were in the same club, the New York Pioneer Club. We competed together. He's quite a storyteller. Talk to him. You will get quite an earful, believe me.
Thank you.
It's an Omer. He's still very active.
No,
Thanks, John.
both of those guys that you mentioned are in the Hall of Fame in Israel.
Yep, and Shaul and Henry's also in the United States. So he won more.
Yes.
Up to his time, he won more until Ron Laird, who was another guy, beat him. He had won within his short competitive period. He won more national champions than anybody. He was incredible, a terrific guy. He also was very active in officiating and promoting the sport until he passed away. A few years before he passed away, he had Alzheimer's, unfortunately. So he sort of faded away gradually. But he was very active in the sport. He officiated afterwards. He promoted the sport. I give a lot of credit to Henry. And by the way, his brother, I'll have to mention this also, was on the ship with me on the St. Louis, which you probably heard of. And his brother, Benno Lascaux, was on the ship as a passenger also on the St. Louis. And he never made it. His brother was killed in France, because when he returned, they sent him back to France, and he entered the French resistance. And he unfortunately got caught. Benno got shot. I mean, I heard about all this. So Henry had a lot of stories to tell.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, John, for sharing those stories. We have two more people with two questions. We will need to close up soon, and I want to respect your time also, Joe. So maybe two quick questions, and then we will say goodbye. Knits.
Waiting on me.
No, someone has their hand raised by the name of Knits. Maybe it's an accidental hand raised. Larry Novick.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I know this person wasn't Jewish, but I always wondered about him because I never knew much about him. What was the role of Avery Brundage in all of this?
Nazi. I'm exaggerating, but
What was he the head of the Olympic? What was he?
He was the head of the U.S. Olympic Committee, and he pushed through. Number one, the United States competing in the 36 Olympics, and they say everything is they say because they aren't saying that he wanted to appease Hitler by not having two Jews running in that 4x100, the one with Marty Glickman and Stoller. So he put in the two black guys, and if you take today's world in consideration, black people were less of an offense to Hitler than Jews.